My name is Dennis Smith, and I have been on the faculty here at the Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service for a very long time. And going back to before the fiscal crisis in the 1970s and through now, I have followed the police of New York with great interest. At the start of that administration, the mayor and the police commissioner held a press conference and announced that in the following year, 1994, crime was going to come down, they said, 10%. Well, crime had been going up for more than a decade. It has started to come down a little bit under Dinkins with community policing, a little bit, but not 10% a year, certainly not 10% a year. So a lot of people in my field in criminology and police studies and so forth, what are they smoking? They're bragging, they're full of themselves. There's no way they're going to bring crime down 10%. And they had experts in our field, people like James Q. Wilson, who wrote a very pioneering book on policing called Varieties of Police Behavior, or David Bailey at SUNY Albany, one of the criminal justice people who study police, wonderful studies of police. He wrote a book in 1994, Police for the Future, in which he argued that the idea that police can bring down crime is a myth. 1994. The idea that police can bring down crime is a myth. They have no known technology for doing that. They can, he argued, really only be expected to respond effectively to crime. Come, take good reports, follow up, investigate, try to find the perpetrator, make an arrest, prosecute them successfully, respond to crime. When Bratton came in as the new police commissioner in New York, he had a very different view. He thought that the police, going back to the time of Robert Peel, founder of the police in London, had a responsibility. Their mission, in fact, was to prevent crime and disorder. Not just to respond to it, but prevent it. And he believed they could do it. And he believed he had done it on our subway system. And so he came in sort of primed in a different direction. And I think when people talk about what happened in New York, they often forget that fundamental change in mission, from a focus on responding to a problem to trying to prevent the problem, was one of the most important things that happened. And it was a big change for the officers in the police department. He had to sort of instill in them a very different idea about what their job was. Imagine under the old system of policing in place, where people were rewarded for responding to crime, and officers got promoted for making arrests. Arrests were one of the major statistics, but clearly arrest is reactive. The only time you make an arrest really is after crime has been committed, the person has been victimized. Precinct commanders typically in New York City had an area and a population they were serving that was bigger than most of those suburban departments with their own police chief and their own police board and all that kind of. Every precinct in New York was bigger than most of those suburban precinct departments. But under the old system, most of their officers' time was not directed by the precinct commander, but by operators, central operators, getting calls, 10 million calls a year, dispatching 5 million cars a year to go to people who had said, police, I need you. And they could be needing them for lots of different things. And we were measuring how rapidly respond to all these calls to 911, on average, and beating up on the police department if it didn't come quickly when called. And if the response time on average went up 40 seconds, it was a news story. Even though, when you look at it in sort of reasonable perspective of kind of systematic management analysis, out of the 600,000 crimes that were reported, serious crimes that were reported in, say, like the 1990, huge volumes of those crimes were things like auto theft and burglary. Neither of those does it make any difference really how quickly the police come. So if you're giving average response time, that's going to dominate the average. If you only have 2,200 homicides, which is an extraordinarily large number, our biggest number, 2243 or something like that in 1990. Huge number, but it's a fraction, it's a minuscule fraction of 600,000 serious crimes in New York. So no matter how fast you respond to violent crimes in progress, it's not going to shape the average the way your response to burglary and auto theft reports does. So we were going to great lengths to measure and pressure performance around a measure that didn't matter much. When Bratton came in and put his focus on crime reduction, he basically said to precinct commanders, "You're my field leaders. You're my field commanders. I want to support you. I want to work with you to figure out what your crime problems are." Again, remembering again that New York City is very diverse and the crime problems of one precinct could be very different from another. And we're going to figure out which of the precincts have the biggest crime problems, and they're going to get most of our attention. And we're going to figure out within those precincts what's the biggest crime problems, and those biggest crime problems are going to get most of our attention. So we're going to be setting priorities. It's not going to be random patrol. It's not going to be random distribution of resources. It's going to be more targeted crime strategies. And so they developed a number of crime strategies for different kinds of crimes, and they communicated this to every precinct commander, and those precinct commanders were expected to communicate it to their lieutenants and their sergeants at roll call, and to diffuse this sort of new set of priorities within the department. Within, the first year, crime was down, I think, 12% the first year. Next year was down another 17%. No place in America had crime come down 29% in 2 years. It was just phenomenal. And so one of the things that happened is police leaders from all over America flocked to New York to learn about CompStat, the system of using comparative statistics. Comparative meaning comparing precincts, comparing trends over time, comparing different kinds of crimes. That whole approach, now called sort of CompStat as the code for it, got a lot of attention from police officials around the country and ultimately around the world. A fair amount of officials from around the world have come to look at this. The violent crime in New York City has been affected extraordinarily by police management reform in New York City. The numbers are also pretty strange. I can give you this chart, but people sort of say, well, it's gone down in other places in the country and in the world, but in this country, for example, auto theft is down 53% in the country, because people say, well, cars were made more difficult to steal. And that's probably true. It's down 53% in the country. It's down 92% as of 2011. I think it's down 94% now. And so it's almost down twice as much in New York as it is down in the rest of the country. In terms of forcible rape, in the country, forcible rape is down 14%. In New York City, it's down 68%. Something in terms of public management, I believe, happened here that's really distinctive and impressive. The shift to measuring, which was part of public management, and the shift to measuring outcomes, results. When they started talking about results in new public management, it was pretty much a synonym for outcome measurement. I think that's here to stay. And it's so deeply embedded, at least in the United States, in the funding of culture, the culture funding. Philanthropies are asking nonprofits for evidence results. Budget agencies are asking agencies for evidence result. When officials went into Michael Bloomberg as mayor and said, I have this reform proposal, I want to change how I do homeless policy or something, he invariably said, well, how are we going to know whether this is working or not? When he introduced certain innovations in his effort to reduce poverty in New York City, to the best of my knowledge, every one of them, he independently got foundations, or he had his own foundation, funded systematic evaluations of those innovations, like conditional cash transfers to try to reduce poverty. That I think is here to stay, with all of its problems. What I think will happen over time is we will work hard to solve the problems of not good enough measures that are easily distorted, measures that are misleading. It's relatively new that we're carefully and broadly measuring performance the way we are. I think increasingly people will recognize that part of performance measurement and management is systematic thinking about performance. And to me that means some version of policymakers and managers developing and having reference to on a regular basis what we call logic models or theories of change. Something that was originally developed in the evaluation literature. People like Carol Weiss introduced the idea that evaluators should map out the logic of a program or policy if they're going to evaluate it, so they can trace the effects from one variable to another. In my work and in the field of performance measure management, we've increasingly imported that idea of the utility of a logic model, or what foundations sometimes call theories of change. What are your assumptions? Be explicit about your assumptions about how what you're doing, your activities, are expected to lead to the results that your mission says you're trying to accomplish. I think the future, that aspect has been not as fully developed in new public management practice as it should have been. It's kind of like what I said earlier about New York City adopted the Mayor's Management Report, which was supposed to be the mayor's planning, management, and reporting system. But because the report part was the part that was mandated by the charter, it's the only part that regularly got attention. The other parts about planning and managing with performance data tended to kind of ebb and flow or be neglected. I think that new public management is going to have to include as part of it how it trains, how people are trained for it, and how they use it in practice, this systematic thinking about their assumptions about how they are going to produce what it is they're producing. If they do that, when they do that, from every place I've looked at it, there are impressive positive results. So